The private jet cut through storm clouds over the Atlantic, carrying Rashid Al-Mansour toward what he feared would be his final goodbye. His father's heart attack had come without warning, and the doctors in Dubai gave him 48 hours at most. Rashid's hands trembled as he clutched his phone, willing it to ring with better news. At 58, he thought he'd prepared himself for this moment, but no amount of wealth or power could shield him from the raw terror of losing the man who taught him everything. His wife, Diane, had insisted on staying behind in New York, claiming someone needed to manage their foundation's gala. He'd been too distraught to argue, too focused on reaching his father's bedside before time ran out. But as the plane descended toward Dubai's glittering skyline, Rashid couldn't shake an unsettling feeling that had nothing to do with his father's condition. Something in Diane's voice during their last call had seemed off, a nervousness that didn't match her words of comfort and support. The feeling intensified when his assistant mentioned seeing Diane's car heading toward their Connecticut estate instead of their Manhattan penthouse. Why would she go there when she'd said she'd be working all weekend? Rashid pushed the thought away, guilt flooding him for doubting his wife of 12 years during such a crisis. Yet the seed of suspicion had been planted, and as he prepared to face his father's mortality, another fear began, growing in the shadows of his mind, one that would soon prove just as devastating as the loss he'd crossed an ocean to confront. Rashid's father, Hassan Al-Mansour, lay in the private hospital suite, looking smaller than Rashid had ever seen him. The legendary businessman who'd built an empire from nothing now seemed fragile against the white sheets, tubes and wires, connecting him to machines that beeped with mechanical precision. Hassan's eyes fluttered open when Rashid took his hand, and despite the oxygen mask, his father managed a weak smile. They'd had their differences over the years. Hassan had never fully approved of Rashid marrying an American woman, believing it would complicate the family's traditional values. But in this moment, none of that mattered. Rashid felt like a boy again, desperate for his father's guidance, terrified of navigating the world without him. "My son," Hassan whispered, his voice barely audible, "there are things I must tell you about trust, about seeing what is truly before us, not what we wish to see." Rashid leaned closer, assuming his father was reflecting on business lessons or family legacy. But Hassan's grip tightened with surprising strength, his eyes suddenly alert and focused. "Your mother, she knew. Women see things men are blind to. Listen to what she tried to tell you last year." The words made little sense to Rashid, whose mother had passed away 18 months earlier. What had she tried to tell him? His mind raced through conversations, looking for meaning in his father's cryptic warning. Before Rashid could ask for clarification, the machines erupted in urgent beeping. Doctors and nurses flooded the room, gently but firmly ushering Rashid out as they worked to stabilize Hassan. Standing in the antiseptic hallway, Rashid felt the walls closing in. His father's words echoed in his mind, mixing with that earlier unease about Diane. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to messages from his mother during her final months. Most were routine check-ins, words of love and encouragement. But then he found it, a text from a year ago that he'd dismissed at the time. "Rashid, Habibti, come visit me alone. There is something about your marriage I must discuss. A woman's intuition is rarely wrong, and I fear for your happiness." Rashid had never made that visit alone. Diane had always been with him during his mother's final months, attentive and caring, the perfect daughter-in-law. His mother had never brought up whatever concerned her when Diane was present, and after she died, Rashid had assumed it was nothing, perhaps just an elderly woman's worries or confusion from her medication. Now, standing in this hospital corridor, half a world away from his wife, those dismissed concerns felt like a warning he'd been too blind to heed. He tried calling Diane, but it went straight to voicemail. He checked the time. It was early evening in Connecticut. She should be answering. His younger sister Layla arrived within the hour, her eyes red from crying. She'd been living in London, but caught the first flight when she heard about their father. As they sat together in the waiting room, Rashid found himself sharing his confused feelings. The cryptic warning from their father, the message from their mother he'd ignored, his unexplained anxiety about Diane's whereabouts. Layla listened quietly, then revealed something that made made Rashid's blood run cold. "Rashid, I didn't want to say anything without proof, but last month when I was visiting New York, I saw Diane having lunch with a man at that French restaurant in Soho. They were holding hands across the table. When I mentioned it to you on the phone, you said it must have been a business meeting." The memory came rushing back. Layla had indeed mentioned seeing Diane, but Rashid had been in the middle of closing a major deal and had barely registered the comment. Diane had explained it away so smoothly. A meeting with their foundation's new board member, a European philanthropist who was helping them expand their work with refugee children. She'd even shown Rashid the man's credentials later, making him feel foolish for even momentarily doubting her. But now, with his father's warning and his mother's unspoken concerns weighing on him, the explanation felt thin. Rashid opened his phone and began searching through his security system's archives. Their Connecticut estate had cameras everywhere, installed after attempted robbery 3 years ago. If Diane was there, he could see for himself what she was doing. What Rashid saw on the security footage made his hands shake so violently he nearly dropped his phone. Diane was indeed at their Connecticut estate, but she wasn't alone. The same man from Layla's description, tall, silver-haired, distinguished, was with her, but they weren't in a business meeting. The timestamp showed they'd arrived together hours ago, and the footage revealed an intimacy that couldn't be explained away. They moved through Rashid's home like a couple, the man's hand familiar on the small of Diane's back, their bodies close as they poured wine in the kitchen. Rashid watched, transfixed by horror, as they settled onto the living room sofa, the same sofa where he and Diane had spent countless evenings planning their future together. Layla gasped when she saw the screen, placing a hand on her brother's shoulder. "Rashid, I'm so sorry. Should we call the police? He could be dangerous." But Rashid barely heard her. He was scrolling further back through the archives, days turning into weeks, weeks into months. The pattern became sickeningly clear. Whenever Rashid traveled for business, which was often, this man appeared. Sometimes they met at the estate. Sometimes they were captured by the entrance camera leaving together in her car. How long had this been going on? How had he been so blind? The successful businessman who'd built his own fortune separate from his father's empire, who prided himself on reading people and situations, he'd been played for a fool in his own home. His phone buzzed with a message from his father's doctor. Hassan was stable for now, but the next 24 hours were critical. Rashid should stay close to the hospital. But Rashid's mind was already calculating flight times, the fastest way back to Connecticut, the confrontation he needed to have. Then another message came through, this one from his head of security in New York. "Mr. Al-Mansour, you asked me to alert you to any unusual activity at the Connecticut property. Your wife has just disabled most of the interior cameras. Only exterior and entrance cameras still active." The message included a timestamp. Just minutes ago, she knew. Somehow, Diane had realized he was watching. Rashid made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of rushing back to confront Diane immediately, he remained at the hospital with his father. Perhaps it was the shock, or perhaps Hassan's earlier words about seeing clearly had struck deeper than Rashid realized. He needed time to think, to understand what he was dealing with before acting. Rashid hired a private investigator in New York, the best in the business, and instructed him to document everything. He wanted to know who this man was, how long the affair had been going on, and most importantly, what Diane's true intentions were. Had she married him for his money? Was she planning to divorce him and take half of everything he'd built? The questions multiplied like a virus, infecting every memory of their 12 years together. His father regained consciousness the next morning, stronger than the doctors expected. Hassan's first question was whether Rashid had understood his warning. When Rashid confirmed that he had, that he'd discovered his wife's betrayal, Hassan's eyes filled with tears. "Your mother knew," he said softly. "She saw how that woman looked at your wealth, not at you. But you were so in love, and we had already lost you once when you chose to build your life in America. We couldn't bear to lose you again by speaking against your choice." The revelation hit Rashid like a physical blow. His parents had known, or at least suspected, and had stayed silent to preserve their relationship with him. What kind of love was that, he wondered, to watch your child walk into danger rather than risk pushing pushing them away by speaking the truth? Over the next 3 days, as Hassan slowly recovered against all odds, Rashid received reports from his investigator that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. The man's name was Philippe Moreau, a French investment consultant with a history of relationships with wealthy women. He'd been married twice before, both times to women with substantial assets, both marriages ending in lucrative divorce settlements. Diane had met him 2 years ago at a charity event in Paris, one that Rashid had skipped due to business commitments. The investigator had found emails, text messages, even recordings from a listening device Philippe apparently used. They'd been planning this for months, waiting for the right moment to file for divorce when the foundation's assets were at their peak and most vulnerable to division. The betrayal went deeper than just adultery. According to the investigators' findings, Diane and Philippe had been systematically positioning foundation assets in ways that would benefit her in a divorce. She'd convinced Rashid to put several properties in joint names, claiming it was for estate planning purposes. She'd gotten him to sign documents that, while appearing to be routine foundation business, actually gave her significant control over accounts containing millions of dollars. Rashid thought back to all the papers he'd signed while distracted by business deals, trusting his wife to handle the details of their shared philanthropic work. Every signature now felt like a step in a trap he'd been too arrogant to see being laid. What hurt most was the realization that nothing about their marriage had been real. The investigator discovered that Diane had been researching wealthy Middle Eastern businessmen for months before they met at that Columbia University fundraiser 12 years ago. She'd positioned herself in his path deliberately, had studied his interests and values, had crafted a persona designed to appeal to him. Even their foundation, the work they did helping refugee children that Rashid thought was born from Diane's genuine compassion, had been part of the strategy. She knew a traditional Arab man would value a wife dedicated to charitable work, would see it as evidence of a good heart. She'd played him from the very beginning, and he'd been so desperate to prove his parents wrong about American women that he'd never looked beneath the surface. Rashid sat with this knowledge while his father continued his miraculous recovery. Hassan's doctor called it one of the most remarkable turnarounds he'd witnessed in his career. But Hassan knew the truth. He'd held on through sheer force of will to deliver his warning to his son. Now that the warning had been heard and understood, his body could begin healing. Father and son spent long hours talking during Hassan's recovery, finally having the honest conversations they should have had years ago. Hassan admitted he'd been too rigid in his views about Rashid's life choices, too controlling. Rashid acknowledged he'd been too proud to listen to his parents' concerns, too determined to prove his independence to accept their wisdom. On the 6th day, with Hassan out of immediate danger, Rashid flew back to New York. He didn't tell Diane he was coming. The investigator had informed him that Diane and Philippe believed they had more time. They thought Hassan's condition would keep Rashid in Dubai for at least another week. That evening, Rashid drove to the Connecticut estate alone, arriving just after sunset. The house looked peaceful from the outside, lights glowing warmly in the windows, smoke curling from the chimney. It looked like a home filled with love and happiness. Rashid knew now that it had never been anything but an elaborate stage set for Diane's performance. He used his key to enter quietly, moving through the familiar rooms that now felt alien and threatening. Voices drifted from the study, his private study, where he kept his most important documents and the few personal items he'd brought from Dubai. Rashid approached silently, his heart pounding not with anxiety, but with a strange, cold clarity. Through the partially open door, he could see them, Diane and Philippe, sitting at his desk, surrounded by papers and file boxes. They were photographing documents with their phones, completely absorbed in their work. Philippe was saying something about moving faster, that they needed to have everything copied before Rashid returned. "He'll be devastated when he finds out," Diane said, her voice carrying none of the warmth Rashid had heard in it for 12 years. "Part of me almost feels bad. He's not a terrible man, really, just incredibly naive for someone so successful." She laughed, a harsh sound Rashid had never heard from her before. "Did you see how easily he signed those transfer documents? I just had to look up at him with those doe eyes and tell him it would help the children. God, these rich men are so predictable. They want to believe they're loved for themselves, not their money, so they blind themselves to the obvious truth." Rashid pushed the door open, the look on their faces, shock, fear, and in Philippe's case a flash of anger, was almost worth the pain of the previous days. Almost, but not quite. "You're right about one thing, Diane," Rashid said, his voice steady despite the rage and hurt coursing through him. "I was naive. I believed in you, in us, in the life we built together. But I'm not the fool you think I am, and neither were my parents." He pulled out his phone and began playing recordings. Everything the investigator had gathered, every damning conversation, every email plotting his financial destruction. As the evidence poured forth, Diane's face drained in color, while Philippe's expression shifted from shock to calculation, clearly trying to determine if there was still a way to salvage their plan. "Rashid, I can explain," Diane started, but he cut her off with a raised hand. "Don't. I've heard enough of your lies. I've seen the emails, the recordings, the bank statements showing how you've been siphoning foundation money into accounts you thought I didn't know about. I know everything, Diane. Who you really are, what you've been doing, how long you've been planning to destroy me." He turned to Philippe. "And you're not even original. The investigator found 2 ex-wives who'd be very interested to know you're running the same con again. One of them is a federal prosecutor now, and she's been looking for a reason to reopen her case against you for fraud." Philippe stood abruptly, his charm dropping away to reveal the predator beneath. "You have nothing that would hold up in court. Those recordings were obtained illegally, I'd wager. And Diane is still your wife. She's entitled to half of everything you own." But Rashid smiled, a cold expression that made Philippe step back. "Actually, she's entitled to nothing. You see, while you were researching wealthy Middle Eastern men, you failed to understand our marriage customs. We signed a prenuptial agreement that's ironclad under both American and Emirati law. Diane walked away with nothing if infidelity could be proven. She claimed she was insulted, that I'd even suggest such a thing, put on quite a performance about trust and love. I felt so guilty that I almost tore it up. But my father insisted, and for once, I listened to him. The silence that followed was profound. Diane's carefully constructed persona shattered completely, replaced by raw fury. "You bastard," she hissed. "You sanctimonious, controlling bastard. Do you know what it's been like playing the devoted Arab wife for 12 years? Attending your boring charity events, pretending to care about your precious refugees, smiling through dinners with your judgmental family who never thought I was good enough? I earned every penny I tried to take from you." Her venom was shocking in its intensity, but Rashid felt oddly detached, as if watching a stranger rant about someone else's life. This woman bore no resemblance to the person he thought he'd married, and he realized now that person had never existed at all. Philippe, seeing their plan crumbling, tried a different approach. "Look, Rashid, let's be reasonable men about this. I'm sure we can come to some arrangement. Diane and I will disappear. You'll never hear from us again, and you'll avoid the public embarrassment of a scandal. Your reputation in the Arab business community would suffer significantly if this became known. A man who couldn't control his own wife, who was made a fool of in his own home. Just give us something to walk away with, and we all move forward." Quietly, the calculated nature of the proposal, treating Rashid's humiliation as a bargaining chip, was almost impressive in its audacity. But Rashid had learned from his father that some things matter more than reputation. "No," he said simply, "you're going to leave this house right now, both of you, taking nothing but the clothes you're wearing. The police are already on their way. They'll want to talk to you about the foundation money you've embezzled. My lawyers will be filing for annulment in the morning based on fraud. And Philippe, those ex-wives, they're very interested in speaking with prosecutors about establishing a pattern mountain of criminal behavior. You should probably leave the country while you still can, though I understand the FBI has already been notified of your travel plans. He'd spent the flight from Dubai putting all the pieces in place, and now he watched them fall exactly as he'd arranged. The scene that unfolded next was almost anticlimactic. Philippe left quickly, showing his true colors by abandoning Diane without a second glance once he realized there was nothing left to gain. Diane tried several more tactics: tears, anger, even an attempt at seduction, but Rashid remained unmoved. When the police arrived, she was still insisting she'd done nothing wrong, that she was the victim of a controlling husband who couldn't accept that she'd fallen out of love with him. The officers had seen it all before, and the evidence Rashid's investigator had gathered was overwhelming. They left with Diane in handcuffs, still protesting, still performing for an audience that no longer believed a word she said. Alone in his study, Rashid surveyed the chaos his wife and her lover had left behind. Files pulled from cabinets, drawers emptied of their contents, the private space where he'd once felt safe violated and ransacked. But instead of devastation, he felt something unexpected: relief. The performance was over. The pretending was done. He could finally grieve for the marriage that had never been real and begin building something authentic in its place. His phone rang. It was Layla calling to check on him. When he told her what had happened, she offered to fly to New York immediately, but Rashid assured her he was fine. Better than fine, actually. For the first time in years, he felt like himself again. The next morning, Rashid's lawyers began the process of unraveling Diane's carefully laid plans. Every property transfer was reversed, every suspicious transaction traced and recovered. The foundation's assets were secured and placed under proper oversight. It would take months to sort through everything completely, but Rashid had excellent people working for him, and they were thorough. More importantly, he started the process of reconnecting with the parts of himself he'd suppressed during his marriage. Diane had been right about one thing. He had molded himself to fit her expectations, trying so hard to be the perfect American husband that he'd lost touch with his roots, his culture, his family's values. Hassan's recovery continued steadily, and Rashid began dividing his time between Dubai and New York. The weeks following Diane's arrest were strange and disorienting. Rashid found himself explaining the situation to friends and colleagues, seeing the shock and sympathy in their eyes. Some had suspected something was wrong, they admitted now, but hadn't known how to broach the subject. A few acquaintances distanced themselves, uncomfortable with the scandal, or perhaps worried about being associated with a man who'd been so publicly deceived. But Rashid's true friends rallied around him, and he learned valuable lessons about who really mattered in his life. The legal proceedings moved forward with predictable ugliness. Diane's lawyers tried to argue that the prenuptial agreement was invalid, that she'd been coerced into signing it, that she deserved compensation for years of marriage, regardless of her actions. But the evidence against her was too strong, and eventually even her lawyers advised her to accept the settlement Rashid offered. Essentially nothing, but it kept her out of prison for the embezzlement charges. Philippe had fled to France, where he was fighting extradition, but his ex-wives had come forward with additional evidence that made his prospects look grim. Rashid took no pleasure in their downfall, but he didn't regret pursuing justice either. What surprised Rashid most during this period was discovering a capacity for forgiveness he hadn't known he possessed. Not forgiveness for Diane, that would take years if it came at all, but forgiveness for himself. He'd been harsh in his self-judgment, berating himself for being blind, for not listening to his parents, for wasting 12 years on a lie. But gradually, with his father's wisdom and Layla's support, he came to see that choosing to trust, choosing to love, choosing to believe in the good in people, these weren't weaknesses. They were strengths that someone with bad intentions had exploited. The fault lay with the exploiter, not with the person who'd had faith. 6 months after the confrontation, Rashid attended his first social event as a single man, a charity gala in Manhattan that he couldn't avoid without disappointing several important foundation donors. He dreaded it, anticipating pitying looks and awkward conversations. But the evening turned out differently than he expected. Yes, there were uncomfortable moments, but there were also genuine connections with people he'd lost touch with during his marriage. One conversation in particular stood out. Margaret Chen, a fellow Foundation board member he'd always respected, pulled him aside during cocktail hour. "Rashid, I hope you don't mind me being direct, but I'm glad you're free of her. Many of us saw what she was doing, how she diminished you, controlled your schedule, isolated you from people who actually cared about you. We tried to say something, but she was always there, always managing your interactions. I'm sorry we didn't find a way through to you." The revelation stunned Rashid. He'd thought he was maintaining his friendships and professional relationships during his marriage, but Margaret's words made him realize how much Diane had indeed isolated him. She'd always had a reason why they couldn't attend this event or that dinner party, always suggested they spend time alone together instead of with his friends. He'd seen it as romantic devotion when it was actually strategic isolation, cutting him off from people who might have seen through her act. How many warning signs had there been that he'd missed because he'd been looking at his marriage through the lens of his own wishful thinking instead of clear-eyed reality? That night, unable to sleep, Rashid began writing. He'd never been much for journaling, but something compelled him to document his experience, not just the betrayal, but the recovery. He wrote about the shame he'd felt, the anger, the profound sense of loss, not just for his marriage, but for his own judgment and self-trust. But he also wrote about the unexpected gifts hidden in the wreckage, the renewed closeness with his father, who was now healthier than he'd been in years, the deeper bond with Layla, who'd proven herself not just a sister but a true friend, the self-knowledge that came from surviving something that had once seemed unsurvivable. As dawn broke over the Manhattan skyline, Rashid realized he was no longer writing about the past. He was writing toward the future. The divorce, technically an annulment based on fraud, was finalized 8 months after that night in Connecticut. Rashid expected to feel celebratory, but instead experienced a quiet settling, like finding solid ground after a long time at sea. The legal end of his marriage didn't change his daily reality much. He'd already reorganized his life around its absence. What did change was his sense of possibility. For the first time since he was in his 20s, Rashid could imagine a future that wasn't constrained by lies or performances. He could simply be himself, a middle-aged Arab man with traditional values and modern sensibilities, someone who'd made mistakes but learned from them, who'd been hurt but wasn't broken. Hassan, now fully recovered, began spending more time in New York, ostensibly to help Rashid with business matters, but really to simply be present for his son. Their relationship had transformed into something neither had experienced before, a friendship between equals, rather than the hierarchical father-son dynamic that had defined their earlier years. One evening, sharing tea in Rashid's penthouse, Hassan brought up a subject they'd been dancing around. "You're still young enough to remarry, to have the family you always wanted. Don't let that woman's betrayal rob you of that future." But Rashid wasn't sure. The idea of trusting someone again, of opening himself up to that vulnerability, seemed impossible. Then, at a Foundation site visit to a refugee resettlement center in Queens, Rashid met someone who would begin to change his mind. Noura Khalil was a 55-year-old Egyptian-American social worker who ran the center's family services program. She had no idea who Rashid was when they first met. She knew he was a Foundation donor, but hadn't connected him to the recent scandal, apparently being one of the few people in their social circle who didn't follow society news. Her lack of pretense was refreshing, as was her obvious passion for her work. She challenged him during their meeting, questioning whether the Foundation's approach to refugee family services was actually helping or just imposing Western solutions on non-Western problems. Rashid found himself defending the Foundation's work, then reconsidering his defense, then ultimately agreeing that she had a point. Over the next several months, Rashid found excuses to visit the Queen Center frequently. He told himself it was due diligence, ensuring Foundation resources were being used effectively. But he knew, and Layla certainly knew when he mentioned Noura for the third time in one conversation, that something else was developing. Noura was nothing like Diane. Where Diane had been polished and smooth, Noura was direct and sometimes abrasive. Where Diane had deferred to Rashid's opinions, Nora challenged him constantly, pushing him to think more deeply about his assumptions. Where Diane had isolated Rashid from others, Nora seemed to know everyone in Queens and was constantly pulling him into conversations with community members, refugees, other social workers. What Rashid appreciated most was Nora's complete lack of interest in his wealth. She'd grown up working class in Brooklyn, the daughter of Egyptian immigrants who'd worked multiple jobs to give their children opportunities. She'd built her career through dedication and skill, not connections or privileges. When Rashid finally asked her to dinner, carefully clarifying it was a personal invitation, not foundation business, her response was characteristically blunt. "I know about your divorce and what happened. I also know you're probably not ready for anything serious, and frankly, neither am I. I divorced my husband 3 years ago after he decided his midlife crisis required a 25-year-old girlfriend. But I like you, and I think we could enjoy each other's company. So yes, dinner sounds nice." Their first date was at a small Egyptian restaurant in Astoria. Nothing fancy or impressive, just good food and genuine conversation. Nora told him about her life, her 2 adult children, her work with refugee families, her struggle to rebuild her identity after her divorce. Rashid found himself sharing more than he'd intended about his own experience, the humiliation and pain, but also the unexpected growth. Nora listened without judgment or excessive sympathy, occasionally offering observations that were so insightful they were almost uncomfortable. "The thing about being betrayed," she said over tea and baklava, "is that it teaches you the difference between being open and being naive. You can still choose to trust people, but you do it with your eyes open now. That's not a bad thing." Rashid and Nora's relationship developed slowly, which suited them both. Neither was interested in grand romantic gestures or rushing toward commitment. They saw each other weekly, sometimes more, sharing meals and long conversations about everything from Middle Eastern politics to the best bakeries in New York. Nora introduced Rashid to parts of the city he'd never explored despite living there for years. Community centers and ethnic restaurants, parks and neighborhoods that tourists never saw. She showed him a New York that was grounded in immigrant experiences and working-class realities, far removed from the elite circles he usually traveled in. Hassan and Layla approved wholeheartedly. When Nora finally met Rashid's family, Hassan told her directly that she reminded him of his late wife, strong, principled, unafraid to speak her mind. Layla pulled Rashid aside after that first meeting and said, "This is what real looks like. Hold on to it." But Rashid was still cautious, still careful. He'd learned his lesson about projecting his wishes onto reality. He observed Nora carefully, not with suspicion, but with honest attention. He noticed how she treated people, servers in restaurants, homeless people on the street, the teenagers she worked with at the center. He watched how she handled stress, disagreement, disappointment. Everything he saw confirmed that she was exactly who she appeared to be. A good, complicated, real human being with no hidden agenda. 6 months into their relationship, Nora's ex-husband died suddenly of a heart attack. Despite their divorce and his betrayal, she was devastated, not for the loss of who he'd become, but for the loss of who he'd been when they first met, for the life they'd built together before it fell apart. Rashid sat with her through her grief, offering support without trying to fix anything. He understood now that sometimes the most loving thing you could do was simply be present, bearing witness to another person's pain without trying to minimize or solve it. Nora's children came to New York for the funeral, and Rashid met them in that terrible context. They were protective of their mother, understandably wary of this new man in her life, but Rashid didn't try to win them over or prove anything. He just helped where he could and stayed out of the way when needed. A year after meeting Nora, Rashid realized he wanted to marry her, not because he needed to be married or because he was trying to replace what he'd lost with Diane. He wanted to build something new with this specific woman who taught him what honest partnership looked like. But the revelation terrified him. How could he trust his judgment after being so wrong before? How could he risk that kind of vulnerability again? He spent weeks wrestling with these questions before finally talking to his father. Hassan's response was simple. "You're asking the wrong question. The question isn't whether you can trust your judgment. The question is whether you can live without her and be happy. If the answer is yes, then don't marry her. But if the answer is no, then you already know what you need to do. Rashid thought about that conversation for days. Could he be happy without Nora? The answer was probably yes. He'd learned he could be happy alone, that his worth and contentment didn't depend on a romantic relationship. But would he be as happy? Would his life be as rich, as challenging, as full of unexpected joy and growth? The answer to that was clearly no. Nora made him better, not in the sense of completing him or filling some void, but in pushing him to be more thoughtful, more engaged with the world, more connected to what mattered. She challenged his assumptions and called him out when he was being obtuse or privileged. She also celebrated his strengths and supported his dreams in ways that felt genuine, because she had her own strengths and dreams that were equally important to her. He proposed on a cold February evening, not at some fancy restaurant or elaborate setup, but in her small apartment in Jackson Heights after she'd cooked dinner for him. It wasn't the kind of proposal he'd imagined as a young man. There was no dramatic declaration or grand gesture. Instead, he simply told her the truth, that he loved who he was when he was with her, that he wanted to build a life together if she'd have him, that he promised to always be honest even when it was difficult. Nora cried, which surprised him because she wasn't usually emotional in obvious ways. Then she laughed and said yes, adding characteristically, "But I'm keeping my apartment for a while, until I'm sure you're not going to turn into an asshole once you get comfortable." They married 6 months later in a small ceremony that blended their traditions. Hassan walked Nora down the aisle alongside her father, a gesture that moved everyone present. Layla served as maid of honor, while Nora's daughter stood beside her as well. The guest list was intimate, just family and close friends, people who actually knew and cared about them, rather than the hundreds of society acquaintances Rashid would have felt obligated to invite during his first marriage. During the ceremony, they exchanged vows they'd written themselves, honest words about partnership and respect, about maintaining their independence while building something shared, about the courage it took to try again after being hurt. The reception was held at the Queen's Community Center, where they'd met, transformed for the evening with flowers and lights, but still fundamentally itself, a space dedicated to serving people who needed help, not impressing people who had everything. It was perfect. Nora's refugee families attended, bringing food from their home countries to share. Hassan gave a toast that had the whole room in tears, talking about how his son had been lost and was now found, how true love was worth waiting for, even when it came later than expected. One of Nora's clients, an elderly Syrian woman who'd lost everything in the war, gave them a blessing in Arabic that Hassan translated, "May your home be filled with honest words and your hearts with brave love." Rashid had worried that remarrying would feel like tempting fate, inviting another disaster. But from the moment he and Nora exchanged rings, he felt only peace. This was different, not better or worse than what he'd thought he had with Diane, but fundamentally different because it was real. There was no performance, no pretending, no strategic positioning. Just two middle-aged people who'd both been hurt, who'd both learned hard lessons, choosing to trust each other with full knowledge that trust could be broken, but believing it was worth the risk anyway. That night, dancing with his new wife, while his father and her children looked on approvingly, Rashid understood something crucial. Happiness wasn't about avoiding pain or protecting yourself from betrayal. It was about remaining open to possibility, even after you'd been taught the cost of openness. The first years of Rashid and Nora's marriage were not without challenges. Blending their lives proved complicated in ways neither had anticipated. Nora was used to independence and found adjusting to Rashid's very different lifestyle disorienting. She initially refused to move into his penthouse, finding it too ostentatious, too removed from the communities she served. They compromised on a brownstone in Brooklyn, expensive by normal standards but modest for someone of Rashid's means, and importantly in a real neighborhood where Nora felt connected to actual life rather than isolated in luxury. Rashid had to learn to navigate the opinions and protective instincts of Nora's adult children, who remained somewhat suspicious of his intentions despite his consistent presence and obvious devotion to their mother. But they worked through each challenge by doing what they'd promised in their vows, maintaining honest communication even when it was uncomfortable, respecting each other's independence while building shared ground, remembering that they were partners, not opponents. When Nora's daughter went through a difficult divorce, Rashid was able to offer both emotional support and practical advice based on his own experience. When Rashid struggled with a business crisis that required difficult ethical decisions, Nora's clear moral compass helped him find his way to the right choice rather than the profitable one. They brought out the best in each other, not by being perfect, but by being real. The foundation's work evolved significantly under Nora's influence. She pushed Rashid to think differently about charitable giving, less about writing checks, and more about empowering communities, less about imposing solutions, and more about listening to what people actually needed. Together, they restructured the foundation's programs, bringing in more voices from the communities they served, ensuring that refugees and immigrants had real decision-making power about their own support services. The changes were controversial, with some of the old guard board members who preferred the traditional model of wealthy benefactors deciding what was best. But Rashid stood firm, backed by Nora's expertise and his father's surprising support. Hassan told the board, "My son spent years listening to someone who told him what he wanted to hear. Now he's listening to someone who tells him what he needs to hear. I suggest you do the same." 3 years into their marriage, Rashid and Nora took a trip to Egypt, visiting the village where her parents had grown up before immigrating to America. It was Nora's first time there. Her parents had never been able to afford to return, and after her father's death, her mother hadn't wanted to go back without him. Walking through the narrow streets where her father had played as a child, meeting distant cousins who still lived in the family's old house, Nora felt connections to her history that she'd always intellectually known existed, but never viscerally experienced. Rashid watched his wife discover parts of herself she'd never had access to before, and he felt grateful that his resources could give her this gift, not as charity or rescue, but as a natural expression of their partnership. In that small Egyptian village, far from New York's sophistication and complexity, Rashid found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. The pain of Diane's betrayal had felt unsurvivable at the time, a wound that would never fully heal. But standing in the evening call to prayer, watching Nora laugh with her newly discovered relatives, he understood that survival wasn't about escaping pain. It was about metabolizing it, allowing it to change you without destroying you. He'd been a different person when he married Diane. Younger, more arrogant, less aware of his own capacity for self-deception. That younger Rashid had needed to go through what he'd gone through to become the person who could recognize and appreciate someone like Nora. That night, sitting on the roof of her cousin's house under a sky full of stars, Nora asked Rashid if he ever thought about Diane, if he ever wondered what had become of her. He admitted he did sometimes, though curiosity more than anger drove those thoughts now. He'd heard through the legal network that she'd left the country, possibly to South America, still running cons under different names. Felipe had eventually been arrested in France and was serving time for fraud. Their story had ended exactly as one might predict for people who built their lives on deception. But Rashid realized he no longer felt satisfaction at their downfall or vindication at being proven right. He simply felt grateful that he'd escaped, that he'd found his way to this rooftop, this woman, this honest life. Now, at 63, Rashid sometimes tells his story to other men going through betrayal and divorce, not as a cautionary tale about trusting the wrong person, but as a story about resilience and second chances. He's careful not to paint himself as a hero or victim, just a man who made mistakes, suffered consequences, and eventually found his way to something real. The biggest lesson, he tells them, isn't about learning to spot deception or protect yourself from bad people. It's about maintaining your capacity for genuine connection even after you've been hurt, about not letting one person's betrayal turn you into someone closed off and defensive. "The woman who hurt me wanted to make me smaller," he says. "She wanted to drain my resources and leave me diminished. The way I defeated her wasn't by becoming harder or more guarded. It was by healing enough to remain open." Hassan lived to see his son's true happiness, passing away peacefully 5 years into Rashid and Nora's marriage. His last words to Rashid were a callback to that desperate conversation in the Dubai hospital. "You learned to see clearly. I can rest now." Rashid mourned deeply, but without regret. They'd had their reconciliation, their honest conversations, their final years of genuine closeness. At the funeral, Nora stood beside him as an equal partner, not performing grief, but genuinely mourning a man who'd become like a father to her as well. She'd learned about dates and figs from Hassan's garden, had debated Middle Eastern politics with him over countless dinners, had earned his respect through her refusal to be anyone other than herself. These days, Rashid and Nora run the foundation together, true partners in both their personal and professional lives. They've expanded their work beyond refugee services to include programs for divorced and widowed people rebuilding their lives, understanding from personal experience how difficult and disorienting that process can be. They teach workshops together on starting over, drawing from both their stories of betrayal, loss, and eventual renewal. When people thank them for their work, for giving hope to those who feel broken beyond repair, Rashid always thinks back to that moment in his father's hospital room when Hassan's cryptic warning set everything in motion. Sometimes the worst moments of your life are doorways to the best ones. You just have to have the courage to walk through the darkness, trusting that light exists on the other side.